Welcome back, everyone, to our Week 35 review. So today, we're taking everything you've learned about the building blocks of life and putting it all together in one unified explainer. Okay, let's dive right into this. We're exploring ecosystem interdependence and the divine web of life to see exactly how nature operates as this perfectly designed system.
But before we get into the heavy science, I really want you to stop and ask yourselves a critical question. What actually happens to the world if just one single species disappears? I mean, it sounds kind of minor, right? Out of the millions of plants and animals out there on Earth, surely losing just one little insect or, one specific type of frog wouldn't matter all that much. Well, as we're going to see today, the balance of our world is incredibly delicate. It is intricately, beautifully connected, and removing even a single thread, it can literally unravel the whole tapestry.
And to truly grasp how this delicate ecosystem works, we really have to look at the source of its design first. And our lesson gives us this profound cosmic perspective right off the bat. It says, you give them their food at the proper time. You open your hand and satisfy the desires of every living thing. That's from Psalm 145, verses 15 and 16. And honestly, this establishes our theological baseline today before we even touch the biology. It tells us that the Earth, it isn't just some random collection of animals. It is a perfectly provisioned, intentional system. God actually set up a rhythm and a balance to make sure that the desires of every living thing are met right at the proper time.
So, let's start with Section 1, the divine web of life and God's balance. Moving right along to Section 2, let's see how this builds and how energy actually flows, straight from the sun to life.
Think about it. Every single action in nature requires energy, whether we're talking about running, growing, hunting, or even just sleeping. And all that energy starts right here, with our amazing producers. So producers are organisms, like the green plants in your backyard or the algae floating in the ocean, and they have this ultimate superpower. They use the sun's radiant energy to literally make their own food through a process called photosynthesis. Basically, they're taking solar power and turning it into biological energy. And because they're the only ones capable of capturing this raw solar energy, producers form the absolute essential base of every single food web on the planet. I mean, without them, the whole system just grinds to a halt.
Which brings us to Section 3, moving the energy. Let's look at consumers and decomposers.
Enter the consumers. Now, these are organisms that cannot make their own food, so they absolutely have to eat others to survive. Now, what's really interesting about this is looking at the exact tiers, how energy is actively transferred from one living thing to another. We start off with our primary consumers, the herbivores, who eat the producers. Just picture a deer eating leaves, right? Then, stepping up the ladder, we have our secondary and tertiary consumers, the carnivores, who eat other animals. So every single time one animal eats another, that original solar energy we talked about is actively being passed along the chain.
But hey, the cycle doesn't just end when a top predator dies. Nope, it gets handed over to the real unsung heroes of the ecosystem, the decomposers. We're talking about organisms like fungi, mushrooms, and microscopic bacteria, and their vital job? To break down dead matter. Imagine a secondary consumer, let's say a fox, reaches the end of its life. Decomposers break down that deceased fox and completely recycle those precious nutrients straight back into the soil. Why? Well, so that new grass can grow, which allows the producers to kickstart that entire magnificent cycle all over again.
Let's look at a really concrete example just to firmly plant this in our minds. Let's walk through this clear, four-step energy engine to see the literal groundwork of the ecosystem in action. Okay, Step 1, the radiant sunlight powers photosynthesis. Step 2, thanks to that sunlight, the grass, which is our producer, grows strong and nutrient-rich. Step 3, a rabbit, our primary consumer, comes hopping along and eats that grass, actively taking in the energy. And finally, Step 4, a fox, our secondary consumer, hunts and eats the rabbit, taking that energy once more. It is a perfectly designed, sequential engine of life.
Now, my sharp 8th graders, I want you to pay really close attention to this distinction, because honestly, nature is rarely just a simple straight line. A food chain, like that sun to grass to rabbit to fox example we just went through, that shows a single, isolated path of energy transfer. But in reality, a fox eats way more than just rabbits, and rabbits are out there competing with insects and deer for the exact same grass. And that brings us to a food web, which shows how many different chains are actually intricately connected together. It perfectly maps out that vast, complex interdependence we were talking about right at the start.
Which leads us to Section 4, web disruptions, and what happens when that balance is lost.
So, what exactly happens when this beautiful design gets threatened by outside forces? Things like severe human pollution, rapid habitat loss, or even sudden natural disasters. I want you to think critically about this for a second. What happens if a terrible disease strikes and all the rabbits in a forest completely disappear? I mean, it's just one animal out of the whole forest, right? Will the rest of the ecosystem just shrug it off and carry on as normal?
The answer is a resounding no. Removing the rabbits causes immediate, cascading effects. Foxes suddenly lose a critical food source. Those predators might literally face starvation. So out of desperation, the foxes are forced to hunt different prey that they wouldn't normally target, which then depletes those populations. Meanwhile, the grass that the rabbits used to eat, it might overgrow, completely choking out other plants. So the crucial point is that in a divine web of life, it's exactly like falling dominoes. Removing one single piece causes this massive chain reaction that harms the entire interconnected system.
Let's move to Section 5, Education, Morality, and Peace. Okay, let's take a deep breath here. We've seen how everything in nature is dependent on this perfect, delicate order. And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates the spiritual and moral balance in our own lives too. This brings us to a really foundational truth, and it's the absolute core thesis of the HeroesMart Academy Godly Learners series. Education without morality will hurt. I want you to think about that incredibly deeply. What is the point of being exceptionally smart or, memorizing the biological food web or becoming a brilliant scientist or leader if we just keep making bad choices that cause pain to ourselves and the people around us? If we don't have a moral compass, a real understanding of God's perfect design, our intelligence is kind of like a disrupted food web. It's totally out of balance, and ultimately, it just causes harm.
But there's an alternative to that pain, a beautiful promise for those who actually align their learning with their faith. Romans 8, verses 6 and 7, promises peace of mind to everyone who keeps their mind spiritual. Just as an undisturbed ecosystem thrives in perfect peace and harmony, our minds and our lives thrive when we connect our scientific understanding of God's physical design with the spiritual peace that comes from a morally grounded education. That is what brings true, lasting harmony to our lives, a fact we see proven time and time again as people deeply engage with this curriculum.
So, as we wrap up this explainer today, I want to leave all of you 8th graders with a final challenge. How does your education reflect God's design? Are you just memorizing facts for a test, or are you actually seeing the brilliant divine web that connects your learning, your morality, and the entire world around you? Keep that in the front of your mind as you review your homework this week. Understand the balance, protect the balance, and bring that spiritual peace into absolutely everything you learn. You've got this, guys. See you next time.